Welcome to Historical Legacies. Here, we dive into history's most intriguing stories, unraveling mysteries and uncovering truths from the past. Subscribe to join our journey through time's greatest moments. Part 1. Early Life and Foundations, 1791 to 1812. James Buchanan was born on April 23, 1791, in Cove Gap, Pennsylvania, in a log cabin nestled in a picturesque valley near the Tuscarora Mountains. His parents, James Buchanan Sr. and Elizabeth Spear Buchanan, were second-generation Irish immigrants who had worked tirelessly to establish themselves in the New World. James Sr. became a successful merchant and farmer, ensuring his children had access to opportunities for advancement. Young James was one of 11 siblings, growing up in an environment that emphasized hard work, education, and moral values. As a boy, Buchanan exhibited a keen intellect and a voracious appetite for learning. His early education was informal, consisting of local tutors and self-study. Recognizing his potential, his parents sent him to Old Stone Academy, a school known for its rigorous classical curriculum. Despite his intelligence, Buchanan was often distracted by his lively personality and penchant for mischief, leading to occasional conflicts with his teachers. These tendencies followed him to Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where he initially struggled with discipline issues. In one notorious incident, he was nearly expelled for unruly behavior but managed to redeem himself by excelling in his studies. This turnaround impressed his professors and set the stage for his future successes. Buchanan graduated in 1809 with honors, a testament to his intellectual capabilities. After college, he chose to pursue a career in law, an esteemed profession that offered both stability and prestige. He apprenticed under James Hopkins, a prominent attorney in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where he honed his analytical skills and developed a meticulous attention to detail. Buchanan was admitted to the Pennsylvania bar in 1812, quickly building a reputation as an astute and diligent lawyer. His legal practice thrived in Lancaster, which was then the state capital and a hub of political activity. This period coincided with the War of 1812, a conflict that would indirectly shape Buchanan's early career. Though he did not initially support the war, seeing it as unnecessary and poorly planned, he volunteered for the Pennsylvania militia when British forces threatened Baltimore. Serving as a private, Buchanan displayed a sense of duty and patriotism that earned him respect among his peers. While his military service was brief and uneventful, it marked the beginning of his public service journey. Buchanan's formative years were critical in shaping the traits that would define his career. His experiences at Dickinson College taught him resilience and the importance of self-improvement, while his legal career provided him with a platform to demonstrate his intellect and persuasive abilities. His time in Lancaster introduced him to the world of politics, as he interacted with influential figures and witnessed the interplay of law and governance firsthand. By the time he entered public service, Buchanan had cultivated a reputation for diligence, professionalism, and a deep understanding of the law. These qualities would serve as the foundation for his political ambitions, even as he faced the complex and often contradictory challenges of mid-19th century America. While his early years showcased his potential, they also revealed hints of the indecision and preference for compromise that would later define his presidency. Despite his successes, Buchanan's life up to 1812 was marked by a cautious approach to leadership, preferring to observe and learn rather than take bold action. These tendencies foreshadowed the man who, decades later, would face the monumental task of leading a divided nation on the brink of war. Part 2. Entry into politics, 1812 to 1820. James Buchanan's entry into politics coincided with a pivotal era in American history. The War of 1812 was raging, and the young nation faced both external threats and internal divisions. While Buchanan initially harbored doubts about the war's necessity, he came to see it as an important assertion of American sovereignty and independence. His brief military service, though modest, strengthened his reputation as a patriot and aligned him with the growing sentiment of national pride. By 1814, Buchanan had already established himself as a successful lawyer in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Lancaster was not only a bustling commercial center, but also a hub of political activity, offering ample opportunities for an ambitious young professional to engage in public life. Buchanan's eloquence and sharp legal mind made him a natural fit for politics, and his reputation quickly attracted the attention of influential local figures. That same year, at the age of 23, Buchanan was elected to the Pennsylvania House of Representatives as a Federalist. This was his first step into public service, marking the beginning of a political career that would span nearly 5 decades. In the Pennsylvania legislature, Buchanan focused on issues relevant to his constituents, including infrastructure improvements and fiscal responsibility. He advocated for the development of roads, canals, and other transportation projects to facilitate commerce in the state's growing economy. His ability to navigate complex legislative debates and forge alliances with colleagues of varying political leanings earned him respect, even from opponents. This experience honed his skills in negotiation and compromise, traits that would define his later political endeavors. Buchanan's service in the state legislature also exposed him to the growing tensions between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. While the Federalists, his party, championed a strong central government and closer ties with Britain, the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, emphasized states' rights and agrarian values. Buchanan initially aligned with the Federalist Party due to its emphasis on law, order, and stability, which resonated with his legal training and moderate temperament. However, the party was in decline, and its inability to adapt to the changing political landscape prompted Buchanan to reconsider his allegiances. By 1820, Buchanan's political career took a significant leap when he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Representing Pennsylvania's 4th Congressional District, he entered national politics during a period of profound transformation. The era of good feelings, characterized by the dominance of the Democratic Republicans, provided a unique political climate. Federalist influence was waning, and Buchanan began to distance himself from the party's rigid ideology. He instead sought a more pragmatic approach, aligning himself with moderate positions that allowed him to navigate the partisan dynamics of the time. In Congress, Buchanan became known for his articulate speeches and measured approach to policymaking. He participated in debates on issues ranging from trade and tariffs to the growing sectional divide between North and South. While he avoided taking strong stances on contentious issues, his ability to craft thoughtful, legally grounded arguments earned him recognition as a rising star. His experience in the House deepened his understanding of the nation's political, economic, and social complexities, setting the stage for his later roles in government. Despite his successes, Buchanan's time in Congress also revealed his cautious nature. He preferred incremental progress over sweeping reforms, a tendency that made him a stabilizing force, but often left him accused of indecision. These years marked the beginning of his evolution as a statesman who sought to balance competing interests while maintaining his own political viability. As he prepared to leave behind the Federalist label and embrace a broader national vision, Buchanan's journey in politics was only just beginning. Part 3. Shifting Political Allegiances, 1824 to 1832. By the 1820s, the Federalist Party's influence had all but vanished from the American political landscape. James Buchanan, recognizing the need to adapt to these shifting political currents, began aligning himself with the dominant Democratic-Republican Party. This transition marked a significant turning point in his career, as he sought to remain relevant in a rapidly changing political environment. The 1824 presidential election was a watershed moment in American politics, as the Democratic-Republican Party splintered into factions. Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and William Crawford represented different visions for the nation's future. Buchanan, though initially neutral, gravitated toward Andrew Jackson's populist message and distrust of entrenched elites. However, he maintained enough distance to avoid becoming entangled in the divisive elections fallout, which saw John Quincy Adams ascend to the presidency through what Jackson's supporters famously called the corrupt bargain with Henry Clay. During Adams's presidency, Buchanan's political philosophy began to evolve. He grew increasingly sympathetic to Jacksonian ideals, which emphasized limited government, states' rights, and the empowerment of the common man. These principles resonated with Buchanan's belief in a constitutional framework that balanced federal authority with individual freedoms. This alignment paved the way for his full embrace of the Democratic Party, which emerged under Jackson's leadership. In 1826, Buchanan was elected to the U.S. Senate following the death of Senator Walter Lowry. His new role elevated his profile nationally, allowing him to engage more directly with critical issues of the day. As a senator, Buchanan initially supported Adams's administration, particularly its focus on internal improvements like roads and canals, which benefited his Pennsylvania constituents. However, as Jackson's popularity surged, Buchanan gradually shifted his allegiance to the emerging Democratic coalition. The election of Andrew Jackson in 1828 cemented Buchanan's transition to the Democratic Party. Jackson's presidency marked the rise of a new political order that emphasized executive power and a direct appeal to the electorate. Buchanan, now firmly in Jackson's camp, supported many of the administration's policies, including opposition to the Bank of the United States. While he admired Jackson's strength and decisiveness, Buchanan often positioned himself as a moderate voice within the party, seeking to balance populist fervor with pragmatic governance. One of the most significant moments during Buchanan's Senate tenure was his role in the nullification crisis of 1832. The crisis erupted when South Carolina, protesting federal tariffs, declared its right to nullify federal laws deemed unconstitutional. Buchanan, a staunch defender of the Constitution, supported Jackson's firm stance against nullification while advocating for compromise to ease tensions. His efforts demonstrated his commitment to preserving the Union, a theme that would recur throughout his career. Buchanan's political realignment during this period reflected his adaptability and growing understanding of the nation's complexities. He carefully navigated the ideological battles of the time, avoiding extreme positions while steadily building his reputation as a skilled legislator and mediator. His ability to appeal to both Northern and Southern Democrats established him as a unifying figure within the party, even as sectional tensions began to rise. Despite his successes, Buchanan's cautious approach sometimes drew criticism. His reluctance to take bold stances on divisive issues, particularly slavery, left some questioning his leadership. However, this cautiousness also enabled him to maintain broad support and avoid alienating key constituencies. As he entered the 1830s, Buchanan stood at the crossroads of ambition and responsibility, poised to take on even greater challenges in the turbulent years ahead. Part 4. Diplomatic and Senate Years, 1832 to 1845. James Buchanan's tenure as a senator coincided with one of the most transformative and contentious periods in American history. It was during these years that he began solidifying his reputation as a statesman, navigating the complexities of national politics with an eye on international relations. His legal expertise, careful diplomacy, and pragmatic approach to governance made him an influential figure within the Democratic Party and the broader political landscape. The nullification crisis of 1832, sparked by South Carolina's resistance to federal tariffs, presented Buchanan with an opportunity to demonstrate his constitutional principles. While Buchanan supported President Andrew Jackson's resolve to maintain federal authority, he simultaneously advocated for conciliation, endorsing a compromise tariff to de-escalate tensions. This dual approach underscored Buchanan's preference for measured solutions that avoided extremes, a characteristic that defined much of his political career. As sectional tensions simmered in the background, Buchanan began focusing on issues that reinforced his support among Pennsylvania constituents. He was a vocal advocate for infrastructure development, particularly projects like the Cumberland Road and canals that connected rural Pennsylvania to burgeoning markets. His emphasis on economic growth through internal improvements reflected his belief in government's role in fostering commerce, while maintaining a cautious stance on the expansion of federal power. In 1834, Buchanan's ambitions took a turn toward foreign affairs when President Jackson considered him for a diplomatic post. Although Buchanan initially declined, He later accepted an appointment as minister to Russia under President Martin Van Buren in 1832. This marked the beginning of Buchanan's foray into international diplomacy, where his legal acumen and negotiation skills found a broader stage. As minister to Russia, Buchanan negotiated the first trade treaty between the United States and the Russian Empire. This agreement, which facilitated American access to Russian ports and markets, highlighted Buchanan's ability to navigate the intricacies of diplomacy while safeguarding national interests. His success in Russia bolstered his reputation as a skilled negotiator and further prepared him for future roles that required balancing competing interests. Upon his return to the United States in 1834, Buchanan resumed his Senate duties with renewed vigor. He became increasingly involved in debates over the balance of power between free and slave states, though he often sought to remain neutral on slavery-related issues. His primary focus remained on economic policies that benefited the northern industrial base, while avoiding alienating southern agrarian interests. This balancing act allowed Buchanan to maintain support from both factions, though it also earned him criticism for failing to take decisive moral stands. By the early 1840s, Buchanan's stature within the Democratic Party had grown considerably. He was regarded as a reliable moderate who could appeal to a broad coalition of voters, making him a valuable asset to the party. As President John Tyler's administration struggled with internal divisions, Buchanan's stability and consistency stood in stark contrast. He played a critical role in maintaining party unity, even as tensions over slavery and territorial expansion continued to intensify. Buchanan's Senate years concluded in 1845 when he was appointed Secretary of State by President James K. Polk. This appointment marked a significant step in his career, giving him a pivotal role in shaping the nation's foreign and domestic policies during a time of rapid expansion. His experience in diplomacy and law made him uniquely suited to manage the challenges of territorial disputes, trade negotiations, and the complex geopolitics of the mid-19th century. These years in the Senate and in Russia cemented Buchanan's image as a deliberate and capable statesman. His cautious, pragmatic approach allowed him to navigate the turbulent political waters of the era while maintaining his political viability. However, the same reluctance to take bold stances that had preserved his broad support also planted the seeds of future criticism as the nation moved closer to the sectional crisis that would define his presidency. Part 5. Secretary of State and the Mexican-American War, 1845 to 1849. James Buchanan's appointment as Secretary of State under President James K. Polk in 1845 marked a pivotal chapter in his career. It placed him at the helm of U.S. foreign policy during a period of significant territorial expansion and heightened tensions both domestically and internationally. As one of Polk's most trusted advisors, Buchanan played a central role in executing the administration's ambitious agenda, particularly in relation to the annexation of Texas, the Oregon boundary dispute, and the Mexican-American War. At the outset of his tenure, Buchanan focused on consolidating the recent annexation of Texas. The move had inflamed tensions with Mexico, which still claimed Texas as its territory. While Buchanan supported Polk's expansionist goals, he also sought to avoid outright conflict. Early on, he proposed a diplomatic resolution by sending envoys to negotiate territorial disputes with Mexico. However, Mexico's refusal to engage in talks left the administration with little recourse, setting the stage for armed confrontation. Buchanan's involvement in the Oregon boundary negotiations showcased his diplomatic acumen. The United States and Britain both laid claim to the Oregon Territory, and tensions threatened to escalate into another war. While some expansionists in the United States demanded control of the entire territory up to the 54 degrees 40 minutes parallel, Buchanan and Polk pursued a more pragmatic approach. Buchanan worked closely with British diplomats to reach a compromise, culminating in the Oregon Treaty of 1846. This agreement established the boundary at the 49th parallel, securing significant territory for the United States while avoiding armed conflict with Britain. Meanwhile, the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, became a defining moment for Buchanan and the Polk administration. Once war broke out, Buchanan played a key role in shaping the diplomatic and political strategies to achieve victory. He helped oversee the drafting of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war and ceded vast territories, including California and much of the Southwest, to the United States. Buchanan viewed this expansion as a fulfillment of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to expand across the continent. Despite these successes, Buchanan's tenure as Secretary of State was not without controversy. The acquisition of new territories reignited the contentious debate over the expansion of slavery. While Buchanan publicly maintained a neutral stance, he privately leaned toward policies that appeased Southern interests, believing that sectional harmony was essential for preserving the Union. This approach drew criticism from Northern abolitionists and highlighted the inherent contradictions in his efforts to balance the competing demands of a divided nation. Buchanan's time in the Polk administration also revealed his cautious yet calculating political instincts. While he supported Polk's aggressive expansionist policies, he often sought to moderate their execution to avoid unnecessary conflicts. This balancing act was emblematic of Buchanan's broader political style, which prioritized stability and compromise over bold or controversial action. However, this same cautiousness sometimes left him vulnerable to accusations of indecision or a lack of moral clarity. By the end of his tenure in 1849, Buchanan had firmly established himself as one of the nation's foremost statesmen. His work as Secretary of State had expanded the nation's borders and elevated its standing on the world stage. Yet, these achievements came at a cost, as the newly acquired territories deepened sectional divides over slavery. Buchanan's efforts to preserve unity through compromise increasingly appeared insufficient in the face of rising tensions. As he returned to private life, Buchanan's political future remained uncertain. Some viewed him as a potential presidential candidate, while others criticized his inability to take a definitive stance on the nation's most pressing issues. Despite these mixed reviews, his experience in navigating the complexities of diplomacy and governance positioned him as a figure of national significance. His reputation as a statesman who prioritized the Union over partisanship would remain central to his political identity, even as the nation moved closer to the brink of disunion. Part 6. The Road to the Presidency, 1849 to 1856. After serving as Secretary of State, James Buchanan returned to private life in 1849, but his political ambitions remained alive. Though he enjoyed a brief respite at Wheatland, his Lancaster estate, Buchanan kept a watchful eye on national politics. During this period, he remained a prominent figure within the Democratic Party, leveraging his extensive network and reputation as a statesman to maintain influence. Buchanan's time away from public office coincided with a period of intensifying sectional tensions. The Compromise of 1850, which sought to address the status of slavery in newly acquired territories, further polarized the nation. While Buchanan supported the compromise as a necessary measure to preserve the Union, his public statements were carefully worded to avoid alienating either Northern or Southern Democrats. This neutrality bolstered his appeal as a potential unifying candidate for the presidency. In 1852, Buchanan re-emerged on the national stage as a contender for the Democratic presidential nomination. However, the party ultimately selected Franklin Pierce, a less divisive figure, as their standard-bearer. Despite this setback, Buchanan's loyalty to the party and his steadfast support for Pierce's campaign solidified his standing as a senior statesman. When Pierce won the presidency, Buchanan was rewarded with the prestigious appointment as Minister to the United Kingdom in 1853. This post not only reinforced Buchanan's credentials as a diplomat, but also removed him from the increasingly volatile domestic political scene. As Minister to the United Kingdom, Buchanan played a key role in negotiating trade agreements and addressing disputes over fishing rights. However, his tenure is perhaps best remembered for the Ostend Manifesto, a controversial document he co-authored alongside American ministers to France and Spain. The manifesto proposed that the United States should acquire Cuba, by purchase or force if necessary, to expand its influence and safeguard slavery in the South. While Buchanan's intentions were rooted in strategic and economic considerations, the manifesto provoked widespread outrage, particularly among Northern abolitionists who saw it as an overt attempt to expand slavery. The backlash to the Ostend Manifesto tarnished Buchanan's reputation among some factions, but it also endeared him to pro-slavery Democrats, particularly in the South. This duality, both a liability and an advantage, positioned him as a candidate capable of bridging the widening divide within the Democratic Party. By 1856, Buchanan's reputation as a statesman who had remained largely uninvolved in the domestic controversies of the preceding years worked to his advantage. The Democratic National Convention of 1856 was fraught with tension, as the party sought a candidate who could unify its fractured base. Buchanan's time abroad shielded him from the divisive Kansas-Nebraska Act and the bloody conflicts it provoked, making him an appealing compromise candidate. His supporters argued that his extensive experience in diplomacy, his commitment to preserving the Union, and his ability to appeal to both Northern and Southern Democrats made him uniquely qualified to lead the nation. Buchanan secured the Democratic nomination on the 17th ballot, defeating prominent rivals such as Stephen H. Douglas and Franklin Pierce. His campaign emphasized his experience and statesmanship, portraying him as a steady hand in a time of crisis. The election itself was highly contentious, with Buchanan facing Republican John C. Fremont and former President Millard Fillmore of the Know Nothing Party. Ultimately, Buchanan won a decisive victory, carrying the majority of Southern states and key Northern states like Pennsylvania. When Buchanan assumed the presidency in 1857, he was the first bachelor to occupy the White House, a personal detail that added an air of mystery to his public persona. His inaugural address reflected his long-standing belief in compromise and conciliation, expressing hope that the nation could overcome its divisions peacefully. Yet, even as he took office, the storm clouds of disunion loomed large, and Buchanan would soon face the greatest challenge of his political career. Part 7. Inauguration and Early Presidency, 1857. James Buchanan entered the presidency in March 1857 at a time of deepening divisions within the United States. The nation was grappling with the expansion of slavery, economic uncertainty, and rising sectional tensions that threatened the fragile bonds of the Union. Buchanan's inaugural address, delivered on a cold and overcast day, outlined his vision for resolving these challenges. He emphasized his commitment to upholding the Constitution, preserving the Union, and respecting the rights of states. His tone was conciliatory, reflecting his belief that reasoned compromise could stave off the looming crisis. Buchanan's inauguration also marked the first use of the East Portico of the Capitol as the setting for the ceremony, symbolizing his intention to bring transparency and openness to his administration. In his address, Buchanan expressed confidence that the issue of slavery would soon be resolved by the Supreme Court. This statement was a clear reference to the impending decision in the Dred Scott v. Sanford case, which was set to be announced just 2 days after his inauguration. Privately, Buchanan had already been informed of the court's decision. He had consulted with several justices before taking office and was aware that the ruling would declare that African Americans could not be citizens and that Congress lacked the authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. Buchanan believed this decision would settle the contentious slavery debate once and for all. However, his involvement in the matter raised questions about the separation of powers and tarnished his administration's credibility among Northerners. Buchanan's early days in office were also shaped by economic turbulence. The nation was recovering from the panic of 1857, a financial crisis that had shaken public confidence and highlighted the stark differences between the industrial North and the agrarian South. Buchanan sought to address the economic downturn by supporting measures to stabilize the banking system and promote internal improvements. However, his reluctance to intervene aggressively in the economy limited the effectiveness of these efforts, leaving many citizens disillusioned with his leadership. In foreign affairs, Buchanan's presidency began with a focus on maintaining peace and asserting American interests abroad. He worked to resolve lingering tensions with Britain over trade and territorial disputes and sought to strengthen ties with Latin American nations. However, his administration faced criticism for its handling of the filibustering expeditions aimed at annexing territories like Nicaragua and Cuba, which were seen as thinly veiled attempts to expand slavery. These controversies further polarized public opinion, particularly in the North, where opposition to the extension of slavery was gaining momentum. Domestically, Buchanan's early presidency was dominated by his response to the violence in Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 had led to bloody clashes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions, a conflict that became known as Bleeding Kansas. Buchanan hoped to resolve the situation by supporting the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution, which aimed to secure Kansas's admission to the Union as a slave state. This decision alienated Northern Democrats and further inflamed sectional tensions, undermining Buchanan's goal of national unity. Buchanan's leadership style during this period reflected his preference for legalistic solutions and his unwavering belief in the rule of law. He approached governance with the mindset of a constitutional lawyer, relying on precedent and established institutions to guide his decisions. While this approach earned him respect in some quarters, it often left him out of touch with the moral urgency of the issues at hand, particularly slavery. His perceived passivity and unwillingness to take bold action left many questioning his capacity to navigate the growing national crisis. As the first year of Buchanan's presidency drew to a close, the nation remained deeply divided. His hopes that the Dred Scott decision would provide a definitive resolution to the slavery issue proved overly optimistic. Instead, the ruling deepened sectional animosities and galvanized abolitionist movements in the North. Buchanan's attempts to maintain harmony between North and South were increasingly viewed as ineffectual, setting the stage for greater challenges in the years to come. Part 8. The Dred Scott Decision and its Fallout, 1857 to 1858. One of the most consequential moments of James Buchanan's presidency occurred just 2 days after his inauguration, with the Supreme Court's ruling in Dred Scott v. Sanford. The case involved Dred Scott, an enslaved man who sued for his freedom on the grounds that he had lived in free territories where slavery was prohibited. The court's decision, authored by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, declared that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, could not be citizens of the United States and had no standing to sue in federal court. Furthermore, it ruled that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in federal territories, effectively nullifying the Missouri Compromise. Buchanan's involvement in the case was a source of immediate controversy. Prior to his inauguration, he had communicated with at least one Supreme Court justice, encouraging a broad ruling that would resolve the slavery issue once and for all. While he did not dictate the court's decision, his behind-the-scenes influence gave the impression that the executive branch had interfered with the judiciary. This perception of collusion further damaged Buchanan's credibility, particularly in the North, where opposition to the expansion of slavery was growing stronger. The fallout from the Dred Scott decision was swift and severe. Instead of quelling the slavery debate, as Buchanan had hoped, the ruling deepened sectional divisions and energized abolitionist movements. In the North, the decision was widely condemned as an overreach by the Southern-dominated Supreme Court, with many viewing it as a direct attack on free state principles. In the South, the decision was celebrated as a victory for states' rights and the protection of slavery, further entrenching the divide between the two regions. Buchanan publicly endorsed the court's decision, arguing that it settled the constitutional question of slavery in the territories. He believed that adherence to the ruling was essential for preserving the Union and maintaining respect for the judiciary. However, his endorsement alienated many Northern Democrats, who saw the decision as a betrayal of their principles and a capitulation to Southern interests. The Democratic Party, already strained by internal divisions, began to fracture further, with Northern and Southern factions increasingly at odds. The Dred Scott ruling also had significant political repercussions for Buchanan's administration. It emboldened pro-slavery forces in Kansas, where the struggle over the state's constitution continued to escalate. Buchanan's decision to support the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution, which sought to admit Kansas as a slave state, only deepened the national crisis. This move was widely viewed as an attempt to impose Southern law on Kansas, undermining the principle of popular sovereignty and inflaming tensions in Congress. Northern Democrats, led by figures like Stephen A. Douglas, vehemently opposed Buchanan's stance on Kansas. Douglas, a proponent of popular sovereignty, argued that the Lecompton Constitution did not reflect the will of Kansas settlers. The conflict between Buchanan and Douglas fractured the Democratic Party, weakening its ability to present a unified front in the face of the growing Republican challenge. This division would prove disastrous in the years to come, as the party struggled to maintain cohesion in the face of mounting sectional tensions. Beyond the immediate political consequences, the Dred Scott decision had profound implications for the national psyche. For many Northerners, the ruling confirmed their worst fears about slave power, conspiracy seeking to dominate federal institutions, and expand slavery into free territories. For Southerners, the decision was a vindication of their constitutional rights and a bulwark against Northern encroachment. These contrasting perceptions further polarized the nation, making compromise increasingly difficult to achieve. As the dust settled from the Dred Scott decision, Buchanan found himself at the center of a storm he could not control. His reliance on legalistic solutions and deference to the Supreme Court alienated key constituencies, eroding his support even within his own party. The decision, rather than resolving the slavery question, set the stage for greater conflict and placed Buchanan's presidency on a trajectory toward deeper crisis. His inability to foresee or mitigate the broader consequences of the ruling underscored the limitations of his leadership in a time of profound national turmoil. Part 9. Bleeding Kansas and the Lecompton Crisis, 1857 to 1858. One of the most defining and divisive episodes of James Buchanan's presidency was the conflict over the admission of Kansas as a state. The territory had become a flashpoint for the national debate over slavery following the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed settlers to determine whether they would permit slavery within their borders. This policy of popular sovereignty led to violent clashes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions, earning the territory the grim nickname Bleeding Kansas. When Buchanan took office, he inherited a deeply fractured situation in Kansas. The territory was governed by rival governments, a pro-slavery administration based in Lecompton and a free state government in Topeka. Buchanan, eager to resolve the issue quickly and assert his authority, aligned himself with the pro-slavery Lecompton government. He believed that supporting the Lecompton Constitution, which permitted slavery, would stabilize the territory and pave the way for Kansas's admission to the Union as a slave state. Buchanan's decision to back the Lecompton Constitution proved highly controversial. Critics accused him of undermining the principle of popular sovereignty, as the Lecompton Constitution had been drafted without fair participation from anti-slavery settlers. In fact, many settlers boycotted the Constitutional Convention, arguing that the process was rigged in favor of pro-slavery forces. Despite these protests, Buchanan submitted the Lecompton Constitution to Congress for approval, sparking a heated national debate. The Lecompton crisis deepened the divide within the Democratic Party. Northern Democrats, led by Senator Stephen A. Douglas, opposed Buchanan's handling of the issue, arguing that the Lecompton Constitution did not reflect the will of Kansas's settlers. Douglas, a staunch advocate of popular sovereignty, clashed openly with Buchanan, accusing him of betraying democratic principles to appease Southern interests. This rift between Buchanan and Douglas marked the beginning of a significant fracture within the Democratic Party, weakening its ability to present a unified front in subsequent elections. The debate over Kansas's admission highlighted Buchanan's leadership style, which often prioritized short-term solutions over long-term stability. He believed that resolving the Kansas question through the Lecompton Constitution would quell sectional tensions and preserve the Union. However, his approach alienated Northern Democrats and strengthened the Republican Party, which rallied around opposition to the expansion of slavery. The Republican Party used the Kansas controversy to solidify its position as a formidable political force, gaining ground in northern states. Ultimately, Congress rejected the Lecompton Constitution, forcing Kansas to hold a new referendum. This time, the settlers decisively voted against slavery, and Kansas was eventually admitted to the Union as a free state in 1861. The failure of the Lecompton Constitution was a significant political defeat for Buchanan, further eroding his credibility and weakening his administration's standing. The Lecompton crisis also exacerbated sectional tensions, making compromise increasingly elusive. Southerners, who had viewed Buchanan as an ally, began to doubt his ability to deliver on their expectations. Northerners, meanwhile, saw his actions as evidence of a pro-slavery bias, further polarizing the national debate. The episode illustrated the limitations of Buchanan's leadership in addressing the most contentious issues of his time, as his reliance on legalistic and procedural solutions failed to address the deeper moral and political divides within the nation. The aftermath of the Lecompton crisis left Buchanan politically isolated. His support among Northern Democrats diminished significantly, and the Democratic Party entered the 1858 midterm elections in disarray. The Republicans, capitalizing on widespread dissatisfaction with Buchanan's handling of Kansas, gained significant ground in Congress. This shift marked the beginning of a realignment in American politics, with the Republican Party emerging as a dominant force in the North and the Democratic Party increasingly confined to Southern strongholds. As Buchanan's presidency progressed, the failure to resolve the Kansas issue symbolized his broader struggles to navigate the sectional crisis. His efforts to maintain national unity through compromise and legal precedent were increasingly outpaced by the rising tide of sectional animosity. The Lecompton crisis, rather than resolving the issue of slavery in the territories, only deepened the divisions that would ultimately lead to the nation's descent into civil war. Part 10. The 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates and the divisions of the Democratic Party. In 1858, the national stage was dominated by a pivotal political contest, the Illinois Senate race between incumbent Democrat Stephen H. Douglas and the up-and-coming Republican challenger, Abraham Lincoln. This election became a national spectacle, thanks in part to the series of 7 debates between Douglas and Lincoln, which would later be known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. These debates, though focused on local issues, became symbolic of the larger national struggle over slavery and the Union, as both men discussed their contrasting visions for the future of America. For President Buchanan, the Illinois Senate race was another flashpoint in the growing rift within the Democratic Party. The debates themselves were marked by a sharp contrast in ideology between Douglas, who advocated for popular sovereignty, the idea that settlers in the territories should decide whether slavery would be permitted, and Lincoln, who argued that slavery should not be allowed to expand into new territories or states. This ideological clash would reverberate across the nation, drawing stark lines between the North and the South. Buchanan, who had been a strong supporter of Douglas's stance on popular sovereignty, was forced into a delicate position as the debates unfolded. He had endorsed the concept of popular sovereignty in his own administration, particularly with the Kansas-Nebraska Act and his handling of the Lecompton Constitution, but the Lincoln-Douglas debates revealed the deepening polarization that Buchanan had struggled to control. While Douglas attempted to balance the demands of both Northern and Southern factions, Buchanan's support of the Lecompton Constitution and the expansion of slavery into new territories had already placed him squarely in the sights of the Republican Party and many Northern Democrats. The debates themselves were widely followed and discussed across the country, especially in the context of Buchanan's administration, which was increasingly viewed as weak and ineffectual. The positions taken by both Douglas and Lincoln reflected the growing divide between the two major political factions, with the Democrats more firmly aligned with Southern interests and the Republicans positioning themselves as the party of anti-slavery expansion. The Lincoln-Douglas debates highlighted the growing tension between Northern and Southern Democrats within the party, which was exacerbated by Buchanan's decisions in Kansas and his endorsement of the Lecompton Constitution. Douglas's insistence on popular sovereignty as a middle ground solution was at odds with Buchanan's more direct support of the Southern cause, and it revealed the extent to which the party was fracturing under the pressure of sectionalism. Douglas, despite his personal connections with Buchanan and the South, made strategic decisions during the debates that would come to haunt him politically. He distanced himself from Buchanan on certain issues, particularly regarding the future of slavery in the territories, and he was forced to clarify his position on Kansas, a state whose future hung in the balance due to Buchanan's mishandling of the Lecompton Constitution. While Douglas sought to hold together the Democratic Party with his doctrine of popular sovereignty, his arguments ultimately did not resonate with the increasingly radicalized Southern Democrats or the newly formed Republican Party. Buchanan, meanwhile, continued to support Douglas in the belief that popular sovereignty was the solution to the slavery question, but he was increasingly criticized for failing to effectively unite his party or solve the deepening national crisis. The inability of the Democratic Party to find common ground on the issue of slavery made it more vulnerable to the emerging Republican Party, which was gaining momentum across the northern states. The political ramifications of the debates and the public exposure of the deep fractures within the Democratic Party led many to question Buchanan's leadership and whether he could steer the nation away from disunion. As the 1858 elections approached, the Democratic Party was becoming more divided, and Buchanan found himself increasingly isolated from both Northern and Southern Democrats. His inability to mediate between the factions and resolve the key issue of slavery effectively left him with little political leverage as the nation moved closer to civil war. The defeat of the Democrats in Illinois, where Lincoln emerged as the moral and political victor, set the stage for the 1860 presidential election, a contest that would seal the fate of the Union. Buchanan's presidency, which began with a promise of compromise and conciliation, was unraveling under the weight of the national crisis. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, with their intense focus on the future of slavery, were a reflection of the broader ideological battle that Buchanan failed to contain during his time in office. His administration's inability to navigate the sectional conflict would lead to a fractured political system and a nation on the brink of collapse. Part 11. The Election of 1860 and the Final Collapse of the Union. As the nation entered the election year of 1860, the deep divisions within the political landscape were evident. The Democratic Party, once the dominant force in American politics, was now severely fractured, unable to present a unified front to address the national crisis that had been steadily escalating throughout James Buchanan's presidency. The central issue, slavery and its expansion into the new territories, had torn apart not only the Democratic Party but the nation itself. The Democratic National Convention of 1860 was the stage for this fracturing, with the party splitting into two factions, one Northern and one Southern. The Northern Democrats, led by Senator Stephen H. Douglas, believed in the continuation of the principle of popular sovereignty, which allowed settlers in new territories to decide for themselves whether they would permit slavery. The Southern Democrats, meanwhile, pushed for a more pro-slavery platform, demanding that the federal government protect slavery in the territories and that the expansion of slavery should be unchecked. Buchanan, who had spent much of his presidency trying to reconcile these factions and prevent disunion, found himself marginalized as the convention unraveled. His support for the Lecompton Constitution and the pro-slavery stance had alienated Northern Democrats, while his inability to effectively contain the violence and turmoil in Kansas had further eroded his political capital. As the 1860 election season unfolded, Buchanan, who had hoped to preserve the Union through diplomacy and compromise, now watched helplessly as the rift between North and South deepened beyond repair. At the Democratic Convention, the inability to reach a compromise led to the nomination of two candidates. Douglas was nominated as the candidate for Northern Democrats, while the Southern Democrats, determined to assert their right to expand slavery, selected John C. Breckinridge, the sitting vice president, as their nominee. This split in the Democratic Party effectively guaranteed that the election would not have a single Democratic candidate, thereby splitting the party's vote and allowing a Republican victory. In contrast, the Republican Party, which had only been founded a few years earlier, coalesced around a platform of opposition to the expansion of slavery into the new territories. The Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln, a relatively unknown figure in national politics, but one whose moderate stance on slavery, opposing its extension but not advocating for immediate abolition, appealed to a broad coalition of anti-slavery factions in the North. Lincoln's appeal was further enhanced by his strong moral opposition to the expansion of slavery and his clear vision of preserving the Union at all costs. The election of 1860 was a bitter contest, as the nation found itself increasingly divided along sectional lines. In the South, Lincoln was viewed as a threat to the institution of slavery, and many Southerners began to talk openly about secession from the Union if he were elected. Buchanan, who was still in office, was unable to prevent this growing sentiment, even though he had repeatedly warned against disunion throughout his presidency. As the election results came in, it became clear that Lincoln had secured a decisive victory in the North, while Breckinridge and Douglas had divided the Southern vote. The aftermath of Lincoln's victory was swift and dramatic. In the weeks following the election, Southern states began to secede from the Union, starting with South Carolina in December 1860. Buchanan, who had hoped to preserve the Union through compromise, was unable to prevent the secession crisis. His final months in office were marked by inaction and indecision, as he clung to the hope that the Union could be saved through diplomacy and dialogue, but the momentum toward war was now unstoppable. Buchanan's failure to address the growing sectional crisis left the nation on the brink of civil war. His administration's inability to heal the rift between North and South, despite his best efforts at compromise, sealed his legacy as a leader who was unable to prevent the dissolution of the Union. Buchanan left office in March 1861, passing the torch to Abraham Lincoln, who would soon face the greatest challenge in American history, the Civil War. Part 12: Buchanan's Legacy and the Failure of Compromise. When James Buchanan left office in 1861, he did so with a tarnished legacy, one marked by the inability to prevent the country's descent into civil war. Despite his decades of service to the nation, both in the executive branch and in the diplomatic corps, his presidency is often remembered as one of the least successful in American history. Buchanan's central failure lay in his belief that compromise and legalistic solutions could resolve the country's profound moral and political divisions. Throughout his time in office, Buchanan remained deeply committed to maintaining the Union through appeasement and negotiation. His response to the rising tension over slavery was rooted in the conviction that both the North and South had valid concerns, and he consistently sought to mediate between the two sides. Yet, this approach increasingly alienated both factions. Northerners, who believed his support for Southern interests was an abdication of moral responsibility, and Southerners, who felt he was insufficiently committed to defending slavery. Buchanan's endorsement of the Dred Scott decision was a key moment in his presidency, as it signaled his willingness to back a Supreme Court ruling that effectively allowed slavery to expand unchecked into new territories. This decision angered many Northern Democrats, as well as the growing Republican opposition, which used it to frame their case against the extension of slavery as not just a political issue, but a moral one. The Dred Scott decision and Buchanan's support for the Lecompton Constitution in Kansas further solidified his reputation as a president who failed to uphold the interests of the majority of the American people. His response to the secession crisis in the aftermath of Lincoln's election also reflected his failure to take decisive action. Buchanan, in his final months in office, insisted that secession was unconstitutional but simultaneously claimed that the federal government had no authority to stop it. His indecision during this critical time was compounded by his belief that the nation could somehow return to normalcy without force or confrontation. Buchanan hoped that once Lincoln took office, the new president would be able to negotiate a peaceful solution, but this assumption was tragically wrong. The Southern states' decision to secede in the face of Lincoln's election was a direct result of Buchanan's inability to keep the Union intact. While Buchanan had attempted to placate the South with legal compromises, his refusal to act decisively in the face of secession left the nation vulnerable to the dissolution of the Union. As a result, Buchanan's presidency failed to provide the leadership needed to prevent the inevitable conflict that would engulf the country in 1861. In retrospect, Buchanan's failure to address the moral question of slavery directly, and his over-reliance on the idea that legal and diplomatic solutions could resolve deep-rooted sectional conflicts, have led many historians to judge his presidency harshly. Buchanan's presidency was one of caution, inaction, and a reliance on outdated political assumptions about the Union's resilience. His belief that the Union could be preserved by accommodating both sides ultimately proved to be a fatal miscalculation. Had Buchanan taken a firmer stand against the expansion of slavery, or taken more decisive action in response to secession, the course of American history might have been different. Unfortunately, his inability to lead the nation through its darkest hour contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War just months after his departure from office. Despite these failures, Buchanan's presidency was not without its moments of significance. He oversaw the signing of the first transcontinental treaty with the purchase of land from Mexico, the Gadsden Purchase, and his administration was marked by attempts to stabilize the financial system in the wake of the Panic of 1857. However, these achievements have largely been overshadowed by his inability to prevent the fragmentation of the Union and the impending war. Buchanan's final years after the presidency were marked by regret over his time in office. He was acutely aware of how his decisions, or lack thereof, had contributed to the deepening national crisis. His place in history is often defined by what he failed to do, rather than what he accomplished, and he remains a figure whose presidency serves as a warning about the dangers of passivity and indecision in times of national peril. Part 13. Buchanan's impact on the Democratic Party. James Buchanan's presidency, which ended in 1861, had profound and lasting effects on the Democratic Party, the nation's dominant political force at the time. Buchanan's inability to reconcile the growing sectional divides between the North and South led to a significant fracture within the party, which would resonate for years after the Civil War. The split that occurred during Buchanan's tenure left the Democratic Party divided along regional lines, a divide that would contribute to its decline as a unified political entity and its inability to prevent the rise of the Republican Party. Buchanan's support for Southern interests, especially his endorsement of the Lecompton Constitution in Kansas, was one of the primary causes of the party's fragmentation. Northern Democrats, particularly those from states that were opposed to the expansion of slavery, began to question Buchanan's commitment to the principles of popular sovereignty and the rights of free states. The resulting rift between Northern and Southern Democrats was deepened by the debates over the admission of Kansas to the Union, which were pivotal in exposing the irreconcilable differences between the two factions. As the Democratic Party became increasingly divided over the issue of slavery, Buchanan's influence waned within both factions. In the North, his inability to prevent the violence in Kansas, along with his failure to prevent the Lecompton Constitution from reaching Congress, diminished his support among moderate Democrats and those who were wary of the spread of slavery. In the South, many Democrats grew disillusioned with Buchanan, believing that he had not done enough to protect their interests or to ensure the protection of slavery in the territories. The schism within the Democratic Party culminated in the 1860 Democratic National Convention, which saw the emergence of two competing factions. The Northern Democrats, under the leadership of Stephen H. Douglas, adopted the principle of popular sovereignty as their platform, while the Southern Democrats, who feared that the election of a Republican president would result in the abolition of slavery, chose to support John C. Breckinridge and a platform that called for federal protection of slavery in the territories. The Democratic Party's failure to present a unified candidate in the 1860 presidential election proved disastrous. With Douglas and Breckinridge splitting the Democratic vote, Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln was able to secure a victory with a broad coalition of northern and western states, even without winning a single southern state. This political defeat left the Democratic Party fractured and disoriented, with the South increasingly disillusioned with the party's ability to protect their interests in the federal government. The fracture within the Democratic Party was not merely political. It also marked a deep cultural and ideological divide that was impossible to bridge in the face of the growing sectional crisis. Buchanan's presidency, characterized by his attempt to balance competing interests and appease both the North and South, ultimately failed to prevent the party from falling apart. The inability of the Democratic Party to resolve its internal tensions over slavery, territorial expansion, and federal power led directly to the party's inability to maintain political control as the nation moved closer to civil war. Buchanan's failure to effectively lead the Democratic Party and to bridge the chasm between Northern and Southern Democrats led to a realignment of American politics. The Republican Party, founded on opposition to the expansion of slavery, emerged as the dominant force in the North, while the Democratic Party was increasingly associated with Southern interests and pro-slavery policies. The result was a fundamental shift in the American political landscape, one that foreshadowed the violent confrontation of the Civil War. Despite his desire to keep the Democratic Party united and to preserve the Union, Buchanan's presidency was ultimately a catalyst for the fragmentation of both. His failure to keep the party together or to forge a meaningful compromise left a lasting scar on American politics, and his legacy as the last president before the Civil War serves as a reminder of the political and moral complexities of the time. The Democratic Party, as it had existed during Buchanan's presidency, never fully recovered from the internal strife that he exacerbated. By the time the Civil War began, the party had become largely identified with the Southern slaveholding interests, and it would not regain its former prominence until after the war's conclusion and the Reconstruction era. Buchanan's time in office thus marked the end of an era for the Democratic Party, setting the stage for the transformation of American politics in the years to come. Part 14: Buchanan and the Road to Secession. As James Buchanan's presidency drew to a close, the growing crisis of secession loomed over the nation, and his inability to take decisive action in the face of this threat remains one of the most significant aspects of his legacy. The election of 1860 had shown just how fractured the United States had become, with Abraham Lincoln's victory setting off a chain reaction in the South, where several states soon began to secede from the Union. Buchanan, who had spent much of his presidency attempting to appease both the North and the South, was left in a precarious position in his final months in office. Buchanan's response to the secession crisis was marked by inaction and confusion. While he declared that he believed secession was illegal, he simultaneously argued that the federal government had no constitutional authority to stop it. This contradictory stance reflected Buchanan's ongoing failure to address the situation with the leadership and decisiveness that was needed. His decision to leave the question of secession to his successor, Abraham Lincoln, rather than taking bold action, left the Union in an even more precarious state. At the time of Lincoln's election, Southern states were already making moves to secede, beginning with South Carolina in December 1860. Buchanan did little to prevent these actions, choosing instead to adopt a passive stance, hoping that the crisis might subside on its own. His administration's failure to prevent South Carolina's secession or to take meaningful steps to hold the Union together reflected Buchanan's inability to confront the issue head-on. He believed that if he left the problem to Lincoln, a solution might emerge, but this complacency allowed the momentum for disunion to build unchecked. Southern leaders, emboldened by Buchanan's weakness, believed they had the support of the federal government to pursue their interests without interference. They saw the election of Lincoln, an avowed opponent of the expansion of slavery, as a direct threat to their way of life, and thus they moved swiftly to assert their independence. Between December 1860 and February 1861, 6 more Southern states followed South Carolina in seceding from the Union: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Buchanan's inability to act in these critical moments was a significant factor in the rapid disintegration of the Union. He had spent much of his presidency trying to prevent secession through legal and diplomatic means, but by the time the Southern states began to secede in earnest, it was clear that compromise was no longer a viable option. Buchanan's belief that secession was illegal but that the government had no power to stop it reflected the broader confusion and paralysis within his administration. His failure to mobilize the military or take a stronger stance against secession allowed the Confederacy to establish itself with little federal resistance. The lack of any significant military response to the secession crisis further emboldened the South. Southern leaders began to establish the Confederate States of America, CSA, in February 1861, with Jefferson Davis named as its president. Buchanan's failure to prevent the formation of the Confederacy or to take action against its leaders is one of the most damning aspects of his presidency. In the face of secession, Buchanan's preference for diplomatic solutions and his reliance on legal arguments became increasingly irrelevant as the nation moved closer to war. In addition to his failure to prevent secession, Buchanan's inability to restore national unity contributed to the growing sense of hopelessness that many Americans felt as the country approached civil war. His refusal to take bold action in the final months of his presidency left a vacuum that Lincoln would have to face head-on upon taking office in March 1861. Buchanan's final days in office were marked by the knowledge that the Union he had sworn to protect was unraveling before his eyes. By the time Buchanan left office, the Confederacy had already established itself, and the nation stood on the brink of war. His presidency, though marked by years of trying to find a peaceful resolution to the sectional conflict, ultimately ended in failure, with the Southern states seceding and the Union on the verge of collapse. Buchanan's inability to confront the secession crisis with strength and resolve contributed directly to the outbreak of the Civil War, a war that would engulf the nation for the next 4 years. Part 15. Buchanan's place in history and the legacy of his presidency. James Buchanan's presidency is often seen as a tragic prelude to the Civil War, his time in office a critical juncture that foreshadowed the national conflict that would follow his departure. Buchanan's attempts to navigate the stormy waters of sectionalism and preserve the Union through compromise ultimately proved insufficient in the face of the deep divisions that had already taken root in American society. His administration's failures in addressing the issues of slavery, secession, and national unity have led many historians to rank him among the least effective presidents in U.S. history. At the heart of Buchanan's presidency was his unwavering belief in the power of diplomacy and legal compromise to resolve the nation's most pressing issues. He was a firm believer in the Constitution and the idea that political solutions could bridge the chasm between the North and South, but his adherence to this ideal was ultimately his downfall. His unwillingness to take decisive action in the face of secession, and his belief that the federal government had no power to force the Southern states to remain in the Union, led to the unraveling of the country he had sworn to preserve. Buchanan's failure to prevent the South's secession and his lack of leadership in responding to the outbreak of civil war left a lasting scar on the nation's collective memory. While some have argued that Buchanan was powerless to prevent the course of events, given the deep divisions between North and South and the entrenched political interests on both sides, others contend that his passivity and indecision only accelerated the disunion he hoped to avoid. One of Buchanan's most significant failures was his approach to the issue of slavery. His support for the Dred Scott decision and his backing of the Lecompton Constitution in Kansas alienated many in the North, while his refusal to take stronger action to protect Southern interests left many in the South feeling betrayed. In both cases, Buchanan's attempts to appease both sides failed miserably, leaving him with little support from either the Northern or Southern factions by the time he left office. Buchanan's legacy, therefore, is marked by this deep division and his inability to rise above the political challenges of his time. His presidency represents a moment in American history when the nation's moral and political differences were too great for compromise to hold, and the country was moving inexorably toward war. While Buchanan himself was deeply invested in preserving the Union, his failure to navigate the complex landscape of sectional tensions sealed the nation's fate and set the stage for the Civil War. Despite his failures, Buchanan was a man of significant experience and accomplishments in public life. Prior to his presidency, he served as a congressman, a senator, and as Secretary of State under President James K. Polk. Buchanan had a deep understanding of foreign affairs and had a reputation for working behind the scenes to support U.S. interests abroad, including in the Oregon boundary dispute and the Gadsden Purchase from Mexico. His extensive diplomatic career, however, did little to equip him to handle the domestic political crisis he faced as president. In retrospect, Buchanan's presidency serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of inaction in times of national crisis. His preference for negotiation and compromise, while admirable in theory, failed to address the fundamental moral and political issues that were dividing the country. Buchanan's presidency, in its failure to prevent secession and avoid war, demonstrates the limits of diplomacy when confronted with entrenched divisions and ideological differences that cannot be reconciled through political bargaining alone. After leaving office, Buchanan spent the remainder of his life largely out of the public eye. He remained in Pennsylvania, reflecting on his presidency and the events that unfolded after his departure from office. Buchanan passed away in 1868, just 3 years after the Civil War ended, leaving behind a legacy defined by his inability to avert the conflict that would define the nation for generations to come. James Buchanan's place in history remains contentious. While he is often remembered for his role in facilitating the disunion of the United States, it is important to recognize the context in which he operated, a period of unprecedented division and an issue, slavery, that had been festering for decades. His presidency marked a final attempt at peace and compromise, but ultimately, the nation's failure to resolve the slavery question through politics led to war, and Buchanan's legacy will forever be intertwined with that fateful moment in history. Buchanan's failure to preserve the Union and avert war will forever shape how his presidency is viewed, yet it is also a reflection of the broader challenges facing the nation during that turbulent era. The lessons of his time in office, of the consequences of failing to confront deep national divisions, remain relevant to this day. Thanks for tuning in to Historical Legacies. If you enjoyed this dive into history, please like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for more fascinating stories from the past.